I wanted to share a story about two old workhorses. But as I started writing, I found myself reliving a childhood memory about a lesson I learned 64 years ago. So now, I'll share a story about a bond between two old plow horses, a 6-year-old little girl, and the night that little girl learned a lesson of life. On the back side of our farm, there was a narrow one-lane road that separated our farm from another farm. The farm across the lane was a working farm, owned by an elderly man named Mr. Gringer. He plowed his fields with a team of workhorses named Bess and Belle. Bess was a sorrel color, and Belle was a gray. Many days, as my dad did chores around the farm, I used to saddle up and ride. I would ride all over the farm. With imaginary adventures in my head, I galloped through the woods or race across the ridge. To get to the back side of our farm, you would have to cross a creek that ran behind the old chicken coop. From that field, I had full view of Mr. Gringer's farm. I would see this team of horses working, plowing the field side by side. I used to stop and watch this team of horses work. I remember thinking how tired and how unhappy they looked. In my eyes, they looked sad, and I felt bad for them. When Bess and Belle weren't working, Mr. Gringer would turn them out to graze. I always would have an apple, carrot, or sugar cubes in my saddlebag. I would tie my horse off, jump the fence, and visit with Bess and Belle, feeding them the treats that I had brought for them. My dad would always have a cup of coffee after dinner at the dinner table. One evening, while having his coffee, I heard my dad telling my mom that Mr. Gringer had called and was going to have to put Bess and Belle down. He said they just couldn't pull their weight anymore, and he was going to have to replace them. Mr. Gringer thought my dad needed to explain to me why I would not see Bess and Belle any longer. He told my dad that he had seen me spending time with them. I was very upset, and I ran to my room. I just couldn't let Bess and Belle be put down. In my 6-year-old mind, just because they couldn't pull a plow didn't mean they had to die. I had to do something, and I knew I didn't have a lot of time, and at 6 years old, I didn't really have a lot of options. That night I emptied my piggy bank and counted my money. All I had was a bunch of change. At the age of 6, I really didn't understand the value of money, so maybe I had enough to buy Bess and Belle. When I got to the farm the next day, I headed to Mr. Gringer's farm. I found him in the barn. I told him I wanted to buy Bess and Belle. He asked me how much money I had. I handed him my money from the piggy bank, nothing but change wrapped in a handkerchief that I had gotten out of my daddy's drawer. I stood there and watched Mr. Gringer open the handkerchief and start counting the money. After counting the money, he looked at me and said, "You have just enough, young lady. Looks like you just bought 2 horses." He then asked me if my daddy knew. I lied. I told Mr. Gringer that my dad had sent me to get the horses. Back in those days, we saved the twine that came around the bales of hay. We would hang them on hooks in the barns because you never knew when you would need them. They actually served many purposes. Mr. Gringer gathered up several strings of twine, made 2 halters, 2 lead straps, and sent me on my way. With 2 horses in tow, I walked Bess and Belle to our farm. I had to get out on the main road, which was a country road, but at 6 years of age, I journeyed on. The only thing that I could think about was the lie I had told to Mr. Gringer. I made the short journey to our farm. Up the drive and through the gate, I encountered my dad as he mowed the front field. I never will forget the look on my dad's face when he saw me coming with 2 large horses that towered over me. My dad never asked any questions. He never said a word. He just shook his head and kept on mowing. He knew what I had done. Bess and Belle spent the rest of their lives on our farm, roaming 170 acres. They were finally free of work, and no more pulling a plow. Those days were over. I used to ride Bess on occasion. I would have to climb up on the fence just to get on her to ride her bareback. With a makeshift bridle made out of twine, we took pleasant strolls around the garden. Belle was not so friendly. She didn't trust like Belle did, and that was okay. She had earned that right to be selective, but Belle was always first in line for a treat. Her favorite was sugar cubes. Little did I know, these two old workhorses that had worked all their life plowing a field was about to teach a little girl a lesson in life. 60+ years later, as I write this, I remember that day as if it all happened yesterday, and remembering that the lie I told that day was never mentioned. My dad and I arrived at the farm at our usual time for feeding. Bess and Belle would always be at the gate waiting for us, or they would be down at the barn. This day they were not at the gate, and as I looked down to the barn, I saw Belle, but I didn't see Bess. I knew right then something was wrong. They were always together. I took off running to the barn. As I got closer to the barn, I saw Bess. She was down. It looked like she tried to get to the barn, but her body had given out. I ran to her. She was still alive, but I knew this was not good. I learned that night something I have carried with me all my life, that you can see a horse's soul if you look into their eyes. I remember my exact words to my dad as he ran towards me. "Call a vet. Bess is sick." We did not have cell phones back then, and my dad had to get in the car and drive to the nearest house. While my dad had gone to call a vet, I sat on the ground and laid Bess's head in my lap. I remember her head being so heavy, and it took everything I had to raise her head into my lap. I remember sitting there on the ground, rubbing her, and telling her it was going to be okay. When I knew in my heart this was not good. Darkness had settled in, and at the young age, I was scared. I remember how cold and how hard the ground felt. For the first time, a place that felt so familiar to me now felt large and scary. The farm was my happy place, and now at that moment, it was a place of hurt and pain. I remember tears running down my face. I felt alone. I was scared of the unknown. I had never experienced anything like this before. I didn't know what to do or how to do it. Then I realized I was not alone. Standing over me was this giant of a horse. Belle, looking down over me, standing right upon me. With one step, she could have crushed me. But she was focused on her best friend. She knew more that night than I knew at that moment. She knew that she was losing something very dear to her. Back in those days, once a big horse like this goes down, they very rarely got back up. Finally, my dad got back. He told me to go to the car. This night was one of the few times I defied my dad. "No, I'm not leaving her." As we waited for the vet, temperatures continued to drop. My legs were going numb from the weight of Bess's head. My dad stood off to the side. He knew he had to let me do this. I was cold. I was scared. My dad was seeing a side of his little girl that he had not seen before. I remember digging deep for strength that night. Finally, the vet got there. He checked her, and looking towards my dad, I saw him shake his head no. I knew what that meant. Nobody had to say a word. At that moment, I felt my heart breaking, 'cause I knew what the vet was going to do. Once again, my dad told me to go to the car, and once again, I told him no, I'm not leaving her. I brought her here, and I'm staying with her. As the vet gave her the shot that would end her life, she died in my arms. I hope she died, knowing that she was loved. That pulling a plow did not define who or what she was. I sat there for what seemed the longest time after Bess had passed, knowing she was gone, but just not wanting to walk away and letting her go. I knew when I walked away, it would be over. I remember my dad lifting Bess's head and taking me by the arm and helping me stand up. He said, in such a gentle voice, "Terry, she's gone." Once I got to my feet, there was Belle, still standing over Bess. She knew that she had lost her best friend, her partner. I don't know to this day how long Bess and Belle had been together as a team, how many miles they must have walked side by side. But I know it was long enough to be a true life team. For the very first time, Belle let me hug her and hold on to her. She didn't pull away. For the first time, I saw gentleness and trust in Belle's eyes. I think at that moment, Belle realized that I was all she had left. that maybe this little person really does love me. That night changed a little girl and an old workhorse's life. Belle found the ability to finally trust a human. I learned holding on to this giant of a horse, that a little girl had strength when she needed to have strength, and it didn't have to be overshadowed by the innocent of youth. Belle and I formed a friendship that night. Though I was never able to ride Belle, she followed me around everywhere I went. She would come to me when I called her, and we shared many hugs after that cold, dark night. Belle lived less than a year after Bess passed away. She grieved every day, and every day you could see the sadness and loneliness in her eyes. I can't explain it, but I found Belle dead, in the same spot that Bess had died. It bothers me to this day that Belle died alone. That I wasn't there for her as I was for Bess. Life has a funny way of giving you tools that will define who you are and how you handle unwelcome life situations. I learned how to be strong even when you are hurting. I learned what letting go really meant. What I learned that night was not learned in a classroom. It was not learned around the dinner table, but learned in a field on a cold night in the dark with two old plow horses that became a part of my life in an unconventional way. I choose to call it the lesson of Bess. Bess and Belle worked hard in the fields of a farm in Frankfort, Kentucky. Even though Mr. Gring kept them fed, they didn't really know the feeling of compassion till they came to our farm. For the first time, to be touched didn't mean they were going to be hooked to a plow. For the first time, when the sun come up, their day didn't mean a day of labor, but instead a day of freedom and a gentle touch of love. That they never had to work for their food anymore. That they could travel in any direction that they wanted, that it didn't have to be in a straight line anymore. They just needed to be a horse, with only one purpose now. And that was to teach a little girl a lesson in life. 64 years later, I share the life story of a little girl and two plow horses whose lives came together to create a memory of love, trust, strength, and purpose. 64 years later, what I thought was the circle of life becomes a memory of a little girl, two old horses, and a father that cared and understood the compassion of strength, innocence, and youth.